So the last two clues that I received from my uncle was that Claude Pippin and his brother, better known as Uncle Doc, were somehow connected to my family. It seemed that it was common knowledge that these brothers were related to us, but it was not exactly confirmed about how they were related. So even though I had their names, for some reason I didn't look them up at the time. I don't know why. I sat them to the side and I just continued researching in my own way, looking at vital records, going to the cemeteries, conducting interviews with Pippin families. I mean, anything that could lead me to the truth, I made an attempt. And it seems like everything I tried, I failed. I was hitting a brick wall. So out the blue, I received a telephone call from the granddaughter of a man named Will Pippin. Will Pippin was the younger brother of Maddie Pippin Smith, the grandmother to Mrs. Coleman. So she gave me a call and told me that she heard about what I was trying to do and recommend that I speak to her uncle, that possibly he could give me all the answers that I was seeking. And I just reiterated to her that I was having a difficult time, that it wasn't so much that people weren't being cooperative, it was just that people didn't know. The hard questions that I was asking people was making them think about the generations of slavery. And most people couldn't go beyond their grandparents and great grandparents, excuse me. So she cut me off and said, well, honey, if my uncle doesn't know the answer, then basically nobody knows. That he was the patriarch and he was the one that had all of the information. So she gave me his number and I gave him a call. And man, when I tell you that conversation lasted about an hour and a half. And that man was not only a wealth of knowledge, but he answered just about every single question that I had. So oral history and about listening to the right story that can lead you to the right person to ask was definitely this situation. So patience was truly a virtue in this situation. So this was the story that he told me. So Mariella and her sister Amy and their mom were on the slave block. They were purchased by a man, but then a couple years later they were put back on the slave block. So the second time they were purchased by a man named Littleberry Pippin, known as LB, from the Clinton community of Greene County, Alabama. So he purchased all three, but by the time he got to his plantation, he divided the Negroes. So he kept Mariella's mother, and she became his domestic servant, and he gave Mariella to his brother, W.H., and that's where she became his domestic servant. So Mariella basically cooked and baked and cleaned, for him. At the time of purchase, he did not have a family. He was not married to his wife, but W.H. had a biracial son named John that lived in the house with him. And John did not do any field work. He basically assisted on the plantation, and he could read and write. And this was his oldest son. So she basically, she didn't live in the house, but she had her own separate cabin to herself. So as he delighted himself in her company, he became fond of her. And the two had a relationship. And he fell in love with my grandma. He fell in love with her. So from this clandestine relationship, he had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. Now, by that time, he had married a woman named Mary Carpenter, and they had a family of their own. But Mary ended up discovering their relationship and noticing these half-white children that he was having. So the story goes that, of course, she didn't like Mary. She despised her, her appearance and her presence. So she basically made life hell for her. She made her do all this extra work. She made all these demands, had all these expectations for her, and if Mary did not meet them, she was beaten, or she was whipped, or she was punished. And it got to a point that Mary got tired of seeing my grandmother's face, and she ordered her husband that he sell her. Now, he did not take her to the slave block. Instead, he sold her to his brother LB, where she was reunited with her mother, and that's where she became an additional domestic servant on the plantation. And if you look in the 1870s census, after they were emancipated, she was still working for him and still living on his property even after he died. So when it came to the initial relationships between Claude and Uncle Doc, Mr. Pippin confirmed to me that these two brothers were the first cousins to his dad, Mattie Pippin Smith, and my great-grandmother. He acknowledged that there was an understanding between the black and white families. They understood their connection, but they could not acknowledge how they were related. They could not address each other as cousin or uncle, but that was the nature of their relationship. He also said that Uncle Doc and Claude were frequent visitors at their house, and he said if you talk to your grandmother, she might tell you that they were frequent visitors at their house too, but my grandmother wasn't saying anything. So he then told me that he did not know the name of Claude Pippin's, grandfather, the man that was supposed to father Mama Ella. But he said, if you continue to research the paternity of the brother's father, which was Walter William Pippin, he said, you'll find your man.